Okay, well, you guys asked and you wanted to see how I had this saturable reactor thing wired up. Basically, I had three giant chunks of power magnetics and a lot of wire, a couple of bridge rectifiers, a variac, capacitors, a light bulb, and a resistor. This is all from memory. We had, okay, the transformer I'll start with. And that was on a variac actually, so let's just say it's, oh man, this pen is not the right one for this tablet. It does not work very well. Anyway, and then we've got some windings out here, and this was 80 volts AC. And then I had my saturable reactor, which is, let me just think of how I want to draw this here. We have, and then we have this just goes around the outside like the Buffalo Gals, and that would have gone into a bridge rectifier. Yep. And just draw the terrible, terrible looking diagram of this. Ugh, that's awful. Let me do that a little better. Okay. Should have given myself a little more room. I hate the way this tablet does this. I actually don't like this tablet very much. There, okay. That's our bridge rectifier. Let's finish the saturable reactor here. This is important. Now, I'm drawing this as two separate cores because effectively it is two separate cores. Then we've got oodles and oodles and oodles of turns on these control, and we're going to say those are in series. And that's my control winding. Hook that up later once I get some stuff figured out. And I should have drawn the symbols for the saturable reactor properly, which would involve going like, oh, it's tight in here. Shit, why does it do that? I just want two sections of lines. That's how you draw saturable magnetics, kind of like that. This is trying to sort of represent what the BH curve, the loop of the BH curve looks like if you're pushing a magnetic core into saturation. Okay, so yeah, that's the salient thing about the saturable reactor, is that you have two separate inductances that are inversely being controlled by the control winding. And the reason for this is so that the power side hasn't got any influence over the control side. Because as you can see, given how I've wired this, if we're specific about polarity, we can put the dots in so we're unambiguous. And then we would look at the and we want to be, of course my brain isn't working the best these days, but this should be over here. Yeah, of course. Let me make sure of this. This goes positive, that goes positive, that goes negative, this goes positive, that goes positive, that goes negative. So I think I've put that on the wrong end. Man, I'm having trouble thinking. The point is that they're wired so that the field induced from this one into the control winding adds deconstructively to the field induced in the other control winding from the other side. So yeah, you do get some transformer action on each one of these, but the point is that the AC induced in the control windings adds to 0 when we are looking into the control windings when they're wired together as a pair. I've been having a lot of trouble with, to be frank, CPTSD related symptoms. So there's just things that are executive dysfunction, cognitive things that are not working very well, but conceptually I can still describe these things well enough. So I'll just ignore that. I'm sure everybody knows where the dot's supposed to be and will correct me. Okay, so then coming out of here, it starts to look like a regular inductor input filter for a power supply. So there's going to be a choke there, and that is the last big honkin' piece of magnetics that I had sitting. So there was just the 3 big things in a row. And had a load resistor, which I had a tap on that. So let's draw that way. It was kind of like this. And I'll just draw it as 2 resistors. And so I've got, that's ugly. So I've got a tap there and a tap there, and I've got a wire I can put on either one of those, like a clip lead. Clean up, yuck, hate this stuff. I am too persnickety to have these ugly lines, but until I get the right pen for this thing, it just doesn't do a good job with this. Just borrowed that off my tough book. Okay, so this was 6 ohms in total. I think this was something like, it was tapped somewhere off center. Say it was like 2.5 and 3.5, something like that. Okay. Time consuming. So as it stands, this if you turn this puppy on, you get a little bit of current in the resistor. So this is all going to be DC over here, but there's nothing going on in the bias winding to bias up the saturable reactor. I'll describe a bit of the action of this. For anybody familiar with magnetics, if you apply a certain magnetic motive force to permeable material, you'll build flux density in that material. That's our measurement of Tesla. It's B on our BH curve. H is the applied field, magnetomotive force. You apply too much, a core can only align its magnetic domains so much before they're nearly all in alignment, and it starts to lose inductance. It starts called magnetic saturation. That happens proportional to current, which is proportional to volt seconds, which shows the integral relationship or derivative. It's a differential equation that shows a relationship of time, current, voltage, and inductance, which is the dual of the one for capacitance, which works in the same way but in inverse. So anyway, this thing, we can apply some DC, and that will pre-magnetize both cores, and it's going to pre-magnetize one in the same direction on half the phase as the wave that's coming in. So in effect, it's pushing it closer to saturation. It will saturate earlier. It's going to push the other one further away from magnetic saturation on that same phase of the. So what I mean by phase is like the positive and negative halves of the wave. So for the first 180 degrees, you're going to see only one of them getting closer to saturation, the other getting further from saturation. They're both being magnetized the same way. For the opposite phase, the last 180 degrees of the wave, the opposite half wave, or I should really say opposite polarity, the other one is going to be closer to saturation, and the first one will be further away from it. This whole thing is arranged this way just so that we can have a DC control winding that doesn't have a net AC induced on it from the AC side of the circuit. You could do it with a single inductor, and you could even arrange for it to saturate full wave if you want, but it means you're going to have some kind of low impedance amplifier circuit or whatever that doesn't mind the AC current coming back. But then there's, what's the point having a magnetic amplifier? The amplifier to drive the bias winding would now be of similar, comparable size and power to what we're getting with this in the first place. It kind of negates the point of it. So yeah, this thing is just there so that we can arbitrarily shift the amount of magnetic field that's being stored in those cores to bias them to a different initial magnetization before anything else goes on. So it's just a way of offsetting or using up a certain amount of their range of their permeability, either using more of it up or actually using less of it up. So yeah, you can, this end in effect is this chunk here, and I described it in the video, is very much like when you use a thyristor switch to make a phase chopper, which is like a triac, for example, or a pair of SCRs wired in reverse with each other. It's going to wait till it's going to have high reactance, which means it doesn't conduct much current up until the voltage reaches a certain point for a certain amount of time. Like I said, it's volt seconds, really the current. And when it gets to the point where it's starting to saturate, it's going to lose reactance, which, is losing inductance, and it's going to start to conduct a lot of current. And if the core material is well chosen for the job, this transition will be somewhat abrupt. It doesn't necessarily need to be abrupt, but the reason we might want it abrupt is that we have more gain in our amplifier, and better control as well. The control will be more linear. So yeah, like I say, let's draw a little bit of diagram of voltages, and then I'll fill in the rest of what I had wired up. You're going to have full wave AC. Let's just call this whole bus kind of neutral. Ignore it. Think of it as not. We're just looking relative across the whole thing. So over here we'd have just full wave AC, and then over here prior to the rectifier, I'll draw two conditions. The first one would be if we're using very little DC bias, or let's say just no bias, we would have just a really tiny bit of AC coming out because there's all this reactance. This is like, I think it was 80 millihenries, which I'm not going to try to do that in my head. Here, let's have a look. We'll do a little bit of math just to give you an idea. I measured the initial inductance of that thing, and it was about 80 millihenries. So the reactance of 80 millihenries at 60 hertz, $30 ohms. So let's say let's put it over here. And we had 80 volts here. So if we have, 3.5 or 6 or whatever ohms over here, and we've got 30 ohms of reactance, which we can sort of think of in terms of resistance over on this side, well, we're not going to get much output into that resistor. It'll be very weak. Now let's say we start to apply bias on these windings. The inductance doesn't change significantly. It changes a little. That would depend on some cores, almost all cores have, especially like electrical steels and stuff, they have an initial inductance that is nothing like the real inductance as you start to actually apply some substantial amount of field to it well before saturation. It'll actually steepen up a bit. You'll get a bit more inductance out of it. So who knows? That 80 millihenries that I measured was on a small input. it's probably quite a bit more inductance once you start to get it going a bit. But whatever the case, we know we have at least 30 ohms of reactance there. But yeah, you start to apply a bit of bias on this thing, and eventually you reach a point where it's going to get into saturation on starting with the peaks of the waves, but as you apply more and more bias, the effect reaches down deeper, closer to zero, up until a point where you've applied so much bias, the poor thing is saturated all the time, even when the AC is off. So it looks very close to being a wire. Really what it looks like, more or less, is the same winding taken off of the core. It still will have the inductance due to the vacuum of space-time. You can't get rid of that. But it won't have much permeability left from the core because we've used it up. It's stored as much field as it can take. So, sorry, I'm kind of rambling. When we're getting into saturation, we're going to start to see that the output wave is now going to be coming up like it was, and then bang, and it's kind of petering off. It's inductive again, and then bang, and that's saturation occurring just for a brief bit of each cycle. Now, I could have drawn that so it was in phase. It wouldn't have been too much effort for me to do that. Just try to do it. My little wave. So, there we go. Low amplitude. So this is a lot of distortion. That is one caveat of these things. But hey, that's the same thing choppers do. That's the triac is kind of waveform is going to look a little different, but it's doing the same thing. That's why they buzz and they hum. And you probably noticed in my video, the thing makes a lot of noise. That's an unavoidable quality of these things, especially big iron ones. So yeah, that's beginning to get into saturation. I could do another one. I'll stick it. I wish I had room to stack them, but I guess I can make room to stack them. Let's do this nicely. No. I'll just drag this down. All right. Okay, I should be able to drag this up on its own. Hopefully it doesn't grab a bit of the diodes. Ugh. You're leaving pieces of my waveforms behind. Can I grab that? Thank you. Stick it back where it's kind of supposed to go. All right. Let's draw an image of getting much further into saturation. So instead of having these brief pulses, which I kind of like pulse width modulation really, but just applied to a sine wave instead of a square, it's going to be more like that. It's doing this weird straight line thing. I need to read the book and get a better understanding of what that is, how to invoke it and when not to. So this starts to look like a quasi-square wave, actually. It's going to be staying in saturation for a greater portion of the phase angle. It's literally increasing the conduction angle up until it's fully saturated, and you basically have more or less this same sine wave coming right out the other end. And if I was to look over here, right there, after the bridge rectifier, world's worst arrow, it would be the same waves that I have over here, except the bottom halves of them would be flipped up. This is a full wave bridge rectifier, so I'm not going to draw that, but just imagine this is now pulsating DC with the same waveforms as the input wave off the reactor, just the bottom is inverted, so it's all DC, all the same polarity. And then the inductor here that's just acting as a regular filter. That was a 180 millihenry inductor, so again, tons of reactance. And I mean, that's enough reactance to filter the fundamental, the 60 cycles a second, quite well. But it filters the harmonics off of this distortion from the reactor extremely well. So the output is actually pretty clean on this. I didn't scope it in the video, but what it would look like out at the resistors is just almost regular ripple, but at a fairly low amplitude. I noticed that without even putting a filter capacitor in here, for, I was putting, I can't remember, but it's putting maybe 10 volts into the whole resistor, so like 10 volts into 6 ohms. The ripple voltage across that thing was like 70 millivolts or 100 millivolts or something like that, like really quite good. So but that's what happens when you have this massive honking inductor there. Of course, I had a capacitor across this as well that would appear here. And that was 10 millifarads, 10,000 microfarads. Oops. Okay. And that just silenced it. I mean, the sad thing is that this little bit of, capacitor, which is like, the size of a film canister, can comfortably store more energy than that inductor any day of the week, and it'll do it with a considerably lower loss. Inductors are terrible. They're really not nice. It all comes down to the fact that Mother Nature does have a few qualities that are not favorable to our physics experiments, and one of them is the relatively low permeability of the vacuum of space-time. It's 4 pi times 10 to the minus 7 henries per meter. Happen to remember that. If that were higher, we could make higher quality factor inductors. In other words, low ESR relative to the inductance, reactance, I should say. We wouldn't need so much core material. We could make a lot more air cored stuff. But unfortunately, we're screwed. So it's either that or we need superconducting wire. It's cheaper to just put core material on it, live with the fact that cores suck. So yeah, I have this 90-pound hunk of iron on my bench, and it can't even store the energy of 40 grams of capacitor. So that's kind of the basic outlay of the thing, and just because I was just playing with this. I just wanted to see what these parts did because I stole them out of something. I stole them out of an arc spectrometer, as a matter of fact. It was the full power supply for that. I thought, well, hey, I should be able to make this self-regulating, because what I was doing with this control winding, I was actually just applying DC off of a bench supply. And so, turn up the output on the bench supply and watch the AC output slowly ramp up. And the reason it's slow is because there's a hell of a lot of inductance on these control windings. I think it was like a Henry or two. So you drop 12 volts across that, and it's like a few seconds later, it's up to current. If you had a high voltage supply with a constant current output, you could rapidly vary the magnetization on here, but you would need significant voltage to change that, because the voltage sets the rate of change of current. That's the proportionality there with inductors. Same reason like, stepper motors and stuff. If you want to spin them fast, you need a very high voltage supply to get enough current into them fast enough to produce a decent amount of force. And that is going to get worse and worse as you increase the speed, which is coming back here. If I want this to act fast, I need a lot of voltage to change the current rapidly, because inductors do not want the current changing, just like capacitors do not want the voltage changing. Anyway, to make this regulate, I was thinking, well, okay, what if I make it so that the input to the control winding is altered by the output voltage at the end of the power supply? So what I ended up doing was I started with like a 12 volt lead acid battery actually, and wired it in series between the output and the control winding, such that if the output is 0, there's 12 volts applied to the control winding. I forget what DC resistance it was, but it was giving me like an amp, which is perfect. An amp is enough to get this thing cranked. And plug in the power, output ramps up rapidly because the core of this thing has a lot of magnetic field in it from that current from the battery. And as this voltage comes up, it subtracts from the 12 volts that I had in the battery, and if in an ideal world, it would go all the way to exactly 12 volts till there was no magnetization left in here. But of course, it's not going to be that good. But it got to like 10 or 11 volts with this much load and had decent regulation. I was actually surprised. I didn't expect it to be as good as that. But then I thought, well, how about I increase the gain on this thing and see if I can get the regulation to be really tight, or even increase the gain so far that I run out of phase margin and it becomes an oscillator, because it's absolutely what it would do. I didn't increase it enough to do that. I figured out that I would need to rearrange a little bit of stuff to make that happen. And I mentioned in the video, I will probably do that later, because this is an amplifier, just as any negative feedback regulated power supply is an amplifier. And amplifiers have phase lag, and with sufficient phase lag and gain, you get positive feedback and therefore have an oscillator. So yeah, we'll try that later on. But to get this thing to regulate more tightly, now I'm trying to remember what exactly did I do with it. I had... Right, so I put a transformer across the output of the saturable reactor prior to the rectifier. I think it was actually a variac. Sure, I'll draw this like this. So, put that all the way down here, and this one there. Oh, in fact, I can just draw the lines over here and make this nice and clean. So we had a variac over here. Right across the input to the bridge rectifier. All right, and then off of this will be, of course, a wiper winding, or a wiper. Okay. So, no, don't ever do that. That's a dead short. Oops. It is never wired like that. Okay. Right. So we have this, and I put a bridge rectifier on that. I'm going to be lazy and just draw it as a brick instead of a bunch of diodes. We can put this like this. And positive and negative. And yeah, I had a resistor. Right, I had to damp it with a, well, shunt it with a resistor. And a capacitor was in there also to keep the AC. Oh, I see. If you hold the pen down for a certain length of time, it draws a dead straight line. Okay, that's useful. Right, so there's a resistor here. Yep. And there was a capacitor across this thing to keep it quiet. And like that. In parallel with the resistor. That was also 10 millifarads. I just figured, screw it, we'll just overdo it. And the resistor was like, I don't remember. It's like 10 ohms or something. And I'm just remembering, I actually had a step-up transformer in here as well. So I apologize for that. Let me just draw that in. Like this. So this would be there. This is kind of getting a bit messy, but whatever. Try to draw a lot of turns because it's a step up, and then this would have been like this. Sure, that works. Okay. I needed, the variac was not getting me far enough to get enough feedback into this thing, so I put in a step-up transformer. And that makes sense, because the voltage I would have got out of here would have been pretty similar to the voltage I get off there already, so what's the point in adding that if I already have this? But if I step it up, then I can get a bit more feedback. Now the thing with doing that this way that I've done it, it's got problems, because it'll give good line regulation, but it will not give good load. Like, this won't improve the load regulation, because this output, you know, it will change dependent on the load, because of the fact that the load will draw more current and thus drop the output off the reactor. But it's not accounting for the losses in the diodes, the output choke, and the effects of all of that stuff. So I'm not correcting for that, but I am compensating a bit, and I'm compensating quite a bit for line loss, which will give me good line regulation, which I did get. I could swing the line over, you know, easily 2 or 3 to 1 ratio in voltage. Like, I could bring this down to like 60 and or less, and the output voltage was only changing like in the tens of percent, you know, 10, 20, 30-ish at the most. I think it was mostly like 10%. So yeah, so we had, now again, I've got to be careful of polarity here, but I remember, okay, so we've got the control winding on there, and then we would have had this wired up to the output. And let me try to make sure that I remember this properly. So I want it to be arranged such that the if this drops in voltage across here, which is telling me that the output itself is dropping for one reason or another, then I want more voltage applied to the control winding. And same with the output, right? So these would have been series 8ing. Therefore, the negative side of this should go to the positive output, which would have been here. So I have some wires crossing, but who cares? And then this would have been, oh, no. Nope. That's supposed to go all the way up, all the way around. Let me fix this. That in actuality would have gone, this is messy as hell, but I hate drawing diagrams this awfully. Okay, bear with me. And then this would just go here. All right, so what was going on is that it is just adding the effects of both feedback terms to the control term at the same time. Yep. And the variac was just there to allow me to adjust the gain of this thing. I think that's how I had it wired. I could be off on this, and I'm really tired right now, so I might have made some mistakes here, but don't worry too much of the specific details of the wiring of this additional feedback component. The salient point is that I had two different feedback nodes being summed to improve the regulation, and I was able, like I say, to get the regulation to be quite tight. In the future, if I want to get it over unity, like I want to get it over to the point where it's lost phase margin and it's oscillating, I will have to take the output off the actual output, all of it, and use all of that in through some kind of a gain increasing circuit. So, you know, there's a few different ways I can do that. I could make it so everything's going on the just all AC or whatever. We'll figure that out later. So anyway, I'm about half an hour into this now. I've got pretty much the basic outlay of this kind of written out for you guys. Again, I'm just kind of puzzling. The reason I'm puzzling with this, and if you're bored with this and you want to stop, there's not that much more I'll say that you don't already know. The reason I'm questioning my drawing of this additional, the gain increasing circuit, is because of the resistor here. And the reason I added that resistor in the first place was because I was expecting some change in the parameters of the circuit to draw current through this in reverse through part of a phase or something like that. So the resistor was there to give some conduction, and this was before I had the cap in. So I was just kind of I didn't plan any of this, so ignore that. Hopefully this answers the question well enough, and I mean, if anybody has some more questions, more specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. And again, just looking at this wiggly thing here, that's just my loose wire for sticking the load resistor on the two different taps, so I can watch the change in regulation with a change in load current. But yeah, that's it. That's what I made. And the if you want to make audio frequency stuff out of this sort of thing, there's a few different things that would have to be done. Like if you want to, you can actually make a single-ended amplifier with one of these. You can make a push-pull amplifier with two of them, And the same stuff goes on as if you're using transistors. You got to bias them somehow. You know, as a brief example, if you're making a single-ended amp with a saturable reactor to make a magnetic amplifier, you would have this part going into a load of some sort that takes up the other half of the wave, because this, you know, might seem counterintuitive. This is taking full wave, but that's my carrier. It's not going to be the audio signal. Remember, the carrier is a static thing at a fixed frequency, generally, very much like in a Class D amplifier. That's just oscillating along, and that's being modulated with audio information, which would be what's coming in on the control winding. So if I was to make an amplifier for audio out of this, really what would happen is I'd have the same arrangement, including the bridge rectifiers, and the output off of those is changing in concert with the input, as we expect. Remember, this is a two-quadrant device. In other words, I can't get a negative swing out of this because of the bridge rectifier, and I can't arrange it in any other way to do so, which is necessary for audio. Audio is alternating current. It must be able to represent waves of positive and negative polarity. If I want both, I'd have to have two reactor circuits and two bridge rectifiers all operating in series. So instead, remember, if we design, for those who kind of understand this stuff, a single-ended amplifier with a transistor or tube, those devices can't pull in both directions either. They pull in one polarity, and if it's single-ended, then we're applying a load, either an inductance or a resistance, to pull the load, the speaker, on the opposite half of the cycle when the device is reducing its conduction and expecting the wave to go in the opposite polarity from which it can pull. Same thing happening here. I could take the output of that bridge rectifier and put a load resistor to some power supply, and then a capacitor to couple it out to the speaker, and bingo, I've got a magnetic amplifier. Not a very efficient one. It would be actually more efficient than a regular resistively loaded Class A single-ended amp using a linear device like a tube or a transistor, because this is one of the beautiful things about magnetic amplifiers is this is more like a Class D amplifier. It's not a dissipative variable going on, like variability going on here. It's a reactive one, just like a Class D circuit does. So yeah, you can make it up that way. That'll get you theoretical maximum of 50% efficiency, which is not realizable. It would be closer to, you know, probably more like 40, 30 on a really well-designed one. But if I put an inductor as a load, just as I do in a tube circuit or a transistor circuit, now the theoretical max efficiency is 100%. It's the same theoretical max efficiency that a regular solid state or tube Class D amplifier has. Again, theoretical maximum. It's a topological maximum efficiency for the topology. As soon as you have real devices, of course you can't achieve that, but with modern semiconductors you can get extremely close. It's disturbing how good they are nowadays. So yeah, if you made a mag amp that was single-ended, it would look very much like a Class D single-ended amp loaded with an inductor, and it could have very high efficiency, as a matter of fact. The other version, push-pull, like I said, it would be basically taking two of these circuits, the reactor and the diodes with some input carrier wave, and sticking them effectively in series and putting the load between them, exactly as we do with any other type of push-pull amplifier, be it a transistor complementary symmetry, or a transistor quasi-complementary, or a transistor transformer coupled complementary, or push-pull tube, or whatever you want. That's how that would. And if you look up online, if you search for Lundahl, that's Swedish. It's Lundahl. Search Lundahl magnetic amplifier, and you will see exactly what I'm referring to in terms of the push-pull circuit in the Google images. A guy named Lundahl runs a company, and I'm pretty sure it's Sweden. It's definitely Scandinavian, who mainly makes, I should remember what they're making. I know they make transformers for tube amplifiers and stuff, but he made one of the few people who made a real audio frequency push-pull magnetic amplifier. And if you look at his circuit, you will see the two of these chunks keep circling, and a carrier supply that's operating at some high frequency. I think it was 70 kilohertz, something like that, to produce a carrier for it to modulate. And it's got all the diodes and all the bits, and it's got a little bit of stuff to set up the bias so that this thing is at a good initial bias current so that it doesn't have massive crossover distortion. It works just like a solid state push-pull amplifier does, except you're doing it with magnetic amplification instead. Okay, we're at 40 minutes. Okay, that's pretty good. I think I've fleshed out a lot of stuff here. Probably a bit overwhelming. I hope it's interesting. That's the whole point of this. I'm not trying to really formally educate anybody. I just do this because I think it's fascinating, and that's what directs my stream of consciousness as I speak. I don't plan any of these videos. Feel free to ask me questions, and if I have an answer, I'll produce it. Cheers.